Okay, so I think, in the context of this ballot measure, it really, it talks about taking away the renter protections that were passed by the city council in August and only allowing rent control if the voters pass an initiative expressly to have rent control. So in November, you will have a choice before you, a ballot measure that says, only voters can pass rent control, and any existing rent control will end if voters pass this ballot measure. It came about, really the beginning of this story was the city council passing rent control. We were the only West Side city that did not have any form of renter protections. So even Beverly Hills had more renter protections than the city of Culver City up until last year. And this first slide is from a postcard that Protect Culver City Renters put together, working with some other local local organizations. And they spoke to a lot of renters, and hundreds of people came to the city council asking for renter protections. And so that is what the city council passed. Let's see, I'm gonna try to get to my next one. There we go. So in August of 2019, we passed an urgency ordinance that had to put in place interim renter protections while we did kind of a deeper dive to see what type of renter protections would be appropriate for Culver City. And we were able to pass it on a 4-to-1 vote. Basically, we put a cap. So whatever the rent had been on June 11th, 2019, that rent could only be raised 3% in the calendar year. It does not apply to single family homes, condos and townhouses, or owner occupied mobile homes, or Section 8 housing. And we also passed other protections for renters that will, so if you're a renter and through no fault of your own, your landlord wants to make you leave, they now have protections that they didn't have before, including relocation assistance. And so for this past year, we've been doing a study and hearing from hundreds and hundreds of stakeholders, a lot of renters, a lot of landlords, a lot of residents in Culver City. And we did a pretty intensive study of the Culver City market and the state of renters in Culver City. And what we found, in my opinion, really bore out what renters and residents were telling us about the renter market in Culver City, which is that renters are increasingly burdened with, you can't hear me? I'm not on mute. Can other folks hear?
We can.
Okay, thank you.
I can hear you.
I can't hear you.
I think Megan froze.
She was good.
Now I can't hear her.
Yeah, she disconnected, so her computer froze. No.
So we've had a technical glitch with our speaker. It must be a computer, a connection problem with the internet connection, the Wi-Fi. So Megan isn't able to talk at the moment, and we'll get her back in the meeting and continuing with her presentation as soon as we can. I'd like to ask everybody if they have their video on to make sure it's off, because it increases the bandwidth and allows the, here's Megan. I'm going to let her back in, see if this works.
I can't reach the person. I'll make
It's
sure.
okay. Don't worry about it.
Here we go. All right.
Okay. Thanks, Megan. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Our internet keeps cutting, and I think it's a problem that a lot of people are having. So I apologize for that, which means, of course, we're not going to be able to see the slides at all. That's really frustrating. Well, hopefully it'll come back in, and then we'll be able to continue with the slides. But I'll just kind of describe some of the results of this study. Nearly a quarter of renters in Culver City spend 50% or more of their income on housing costs. And most lower income households report excessive cost burden. Now remember, this is in a context where there were no renter protections. So that meant that landlords in Culver City, unlike any other West Side city, could go ahead and raise the rent multiple times a year to whatever percentage that they wanted. And indeed, we heard from a lot of residents who had extraordinary rent raises, 100% or even more, and evictions without cause. So it was becoming a real problem. And I think that's why folks came to us to ask the council to pass rent control. There's also a big disparity in incomes. So renters have a tendency to be a lot lower income than homeowners in Culver City. And renters also represent basically half of almost half of the residents in Culver City. Also, nationally, we're having an incredibly important discussion about race and about racial justice. And housing and racism are intimately tied. And to have fair housing, according to basically every academic you can think of, you need to look at housing policy, including strong renter protections in order to achieve racial justice. So that's basically the context of how we passed renter protections in Culver City. Pretty much around that time, there was a PAC, a political action committee that formed that, if you recall, the folks that, the organization that had been asking for renter protections was called Protect Culver City Renters. And this PAC, this political action committee, is called Protect Culver City. And Protect Culver City put forward a ballot measure that will, the ballot measure that we're talking about, which is renter protections can only be or rent control can only be passed by ballot measure, and any existing rent control would disappear if their ballot measure passes. I will note that the main organizer of Protect Culver City is Ron Basilian, who you might recognize as someone who has run against our Congressmember Karen Bass as the Republican candidate. So that's like the main person who and I think he's the president of Protect Culver City, or maybe the chair. So they submitted a ballot measure to the city, and what the ballot measure says is, and I'm just going to read, directly the language from the ballot measure. It would change the municipal code to say, A, the city council shall not pass any ordinance establishing either an interim or permanent rent control measure or a prohibition on the increase in residential rents unless and until that proposed rent control measure is submitted to the electorate and approved by a majority vote. That's the first part. The second part, and I hopefully will be able to provide these slides to you afterwards, just so you can see all the text. The second part is all ordinances that establish either an interim or permanent rent control measure or prohibit the increase in residential rents imposed after January 1st, 2019, ours passed in August 2019, shall cease to be imposed unless and until approved by the electorate. So the effect is clear. It would end rent control. Unless somebody puts a separate ballot measure to create rent control, which is not what they're actually proposing to do. I did want to add that because of COVID-19, the city council also took another measure to prohibit all evictions during this local emergency. That counts not only for renters, for residents, but it also counts for smaller commercial, like smaller restaurants, smaller businesses. So they wouldn't be evicted at this time either. And then the next steps, here we go. My husband is trying to put me on again, so sorry. Sorry about that. You heard me say that, right? Let's try this one more time. The joys of internet at this point. Okay. Oh, great. So the next steps, and this is actually pending, the city council still needs to finalize the renter protections and rent control that we have on the books right now. And we're actually going to have a special city council meeting on July 16th to have that discussion. And the first thing we need to do is do a little extension to our interim rent control measures, and then decide on what the final measures would be. So those are the next steps in terms of the city council actions. And I found this on the California Democratic Party 2020 platform. And just, since we're at the Dem Club, wanted to point out that there is in the platform support for strong tenant and affordability protections, and also working to preserve and protect buildings that are under rent control or rent stabilization in the state of California. So it definitely is in line with the Democratic Party as well. So if you wanted to see, let's see, as I'm ready to hand it over for questions. I do apologize for the technical issues that seem to be unending. But what we can do is, if you want, we can also go back to some of the slides during the Q&A, and I can, we can go over some of the details of the renter protections that we currently have, some of the precise language that Protect Culver City put forward, and the next step. So I will hand it over for discussion, and appreciate your patience with me during the mishaps with the screen share. So I don't know who wants to moderate the questions, if people are going to put questions in the chat, or how do you want to do it,
Are you
Pete?
gonna handle it?
I will, I'll ask some questions for now.
There's a couple in the chat already.
Yeah. Do you have a first question for me, Cynthia?
Oh, I didn't write them down.
Oh, okay. I'll go to the chat now.
I'm sorry. Or,
I'm going to ask a few questions here. Let me, can everybody hear me? Can you hear me, Cynthia?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I have a
If I see you-
question. I
Go
have
ahead.
a question here from Kimberly. McCann.
In the
Waiting room.
Question. Sorry, can everybody mute themselves while we're doing this, because it saves bandwidth and keeps the. Okay. Question: isn't it true that most people have to budget close to 50% earnings to pay for housing and housing expenses?
Well, we did have the slide with with the study that has the exact breakdown. And let me just pull it up, because then we can look at the real numbers from the study. So I'm just going to go through. Here we go. Oops.
Well, I'm trying to
So we've got
let Susie Shannon into the.
43% of Culver City renters spend 30% or more of their income on housing costs, and nearly a quarter spend 50% or more of their income on housing costs.
My point is, it's true of homeowners too, Megan. We have pretty much a similar situation.
Homeowners too. Well, this is about renters. So for if I've not heard of any there are programs to help for homeowners, but this is not the subject of this evening.
I just think it's important to note that we all have hardships.
Sure. Were there other questions?
Yeah, let me, is this, oh. How does the moratorium apply to owner-occupied roommate situations and shared housing, where one person is unable to pay rent could directly impact other members of the household?
Huh. That's a very different situation, and I would have to defer you to staff for that, because does that mean that each resident, each housemate has an individual lease? Are they on the lease? Are they not on the lease? What this ordinance deals with is really the relationship with the landlord and the renter, but individual renters between themselves would be a different type of situation. And if you go to culvercity.org/rent control, or even just rent, culvercity.org/rent, there is an abundance of information and phone numbers where you can call and ask our staff and have some individualized help for those precise issues. Were there other questions?
Yes, I have one.
I have another question here. This is, will the council put rent control on the November ballot for voters to approve?
Not that I'm aware of. I've not heard in a public meeting that proposal from my colleagues. I mean, you know, there's.
Oh, Megan, could you stop the sharing? So,
Oh, sure, yeah, no problem.
because I'm having a hard time seeing who's coming in here. Yeah,
Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you know, what legislative bodies do is we legislate, right? We listen to residents, we make legislation, and we're really big on public input, for example. And so, you know, to have legislation like this just be written at the ballot box makes it very inflexible. And, you know, generally speaking, makes legislation very hard. And you can see in California the results of all of the different ballot measures that can be, you know, often highly confusing, and you're locked in, right? Like think of Prop 13, for example. You're locked in for decades and decades, and it's really hard to change these things through, you know, a vote of the people. So, but when you're doing it as a legislative body, you can tweak it, you can, you know, you can be really responsive to specific issues that come up, you can make changes. And I think that's something that, you know, that's our job, right? So I think that's what we were elected to do.
Okay, I have another question. This is, it appears the ballot measure only targets rent control, not any of the other renter protections. Is that correct? If so, do you have a theory why? Was that an oversight, or are there legal reasons?
You know, this was written by Protect Culver City. I don't know what their thinking or strategy was. All I know is, you know, what they've published, what's available to see online on their website. And so I'm afraid I don't have insight into what their process was.
Okay, let me see another question here. Bottom line it, please, Megan. If this ballot measure passes, does it basically mean that there will be no rent control or protection until a new ballot measure is passed?
Correct.
Thank you. We have more in the chat. Let me see. I'm seeing one here, and I'm not sure, maybe I better go back and go in order here.
Should I read them out loud? I see one,
Yeah,
as a general rule, your housing costs shouldn't exceed 30% of your take-home income. Correct. And that is what the federal government says. And yes, absolutely true.
My next question would be, doesn't making rent control a ballot measure give undue influence to groups with money? Protect Culver City did not collect the signatures themselves, but paid signature collectors. Protect Culver City raised large sums of money from landlords outside Culver City.
Yeah, I mean, I believe that that's what their public campaign disclosure reflects, and so yeah, that is.
I have another question, which occurred to me. Could this ballot measure nullify the rent control by the state, or will we still have that? In other words, if this two questions really from my point of view. If this statewide ballot measure we're going to hear from in the next half hour passes, would we this would still stand. The local measure would keep us from having the city council passed rent control, and it would still have to be passed by the voters. Am I right?
If this measure were to pass, it would not nullify the state, which has a 5% cap and a lot less protections than the one that we made specifically for Culver City. So the statewide covers the entire state, right? It covers, very different markets. And we know that the Culver City market is different from, say Fresno, for example, or Bakersfield, or even San Francisco. And so again, the statewide would still be in place, but it is absolutely not tailored for Culver City.
The one that just came up here, the current state law is AB 1482. The cap is the consumer price index plus 5%. So it can be up to 10%. Oh, that's a comment more than a question, I guess.
Yeah, so it's a lot more than the 3% cap that we have currently.
Let's see, do we have it? Let's see. Yeah, we're going to have to wrap the first half hour up because we have two more speakers that are going to be talking about the state ballot proposition that's going to be also on the November ballot. So
Okay.
I'd like to thank Megan and everyone who submitted questions and comments, and we will move on to our next pair of speakers.
Yeah,
And
and
I
thank
wanna
you for
see-
inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan. And let me see if we have our speakers here. Susie Shannon. And I'm,
213. Yeah, the phone number is 213-880-3065.
she might have changed the phone number to, oh, it's what again?
213.
Ah. Okay, Susie, I just unmuted your phone. Can you hear me?
Hi, I'm on.
Okay, this is Susie Shannon. Susie is a member of the Democratic National Committee, am I right?
Yes, I am.
And she is the policy person for the statewide rent control initiative. And she's one of our speakers for the second half hour, which is about the statewide ballot initiative. You have the floor, Susie.
Great, thank you. So I just want to thank the Culver City Democratic Club so much for taking up Proposition 21, which is the Rental Affordability Act. I am a member of the Democratic National Committee. I'm also on the executive board for the California Democratic Party and a member of the LA County Democratic Party. And so I know a lot of folks who are in the Culver City Democratic Club, and I hope they're on tonight. So I'm the policy director for the Proposition 21 campaign, and I'm asking you to vote to endorse it. I know that it may not come up for an endorsement tonight, but I'd like to explain sort of what it is. So Proposition 21 is a homeless prevention initiative and an anti-gentrification initiative, and it will be on the November ballot. And basically, many of us know that we have been facing increasing homelessness. LA County is arguably the homeless capital of the United States. We go back and forth with New York for that title. We have seen an increase in homelessness year after year in LA County. We have increased in homelessness in the state of California from, I remember in 2016, it was 115,000 to now 151,000 people who are homeless in California, and almost 70,000 who are homeless in the county of Los Angeles. So something is very wrong. What this initiative does actually is tackle folks who are rent burdened. So we have, I think somebody mentioned this earlier, but 30% of our renters actually pay over 50% of their income in rent, and 50% pay over 30%. So that's a lot of people who are rent burdened. And UCLA just did a study in the last couple of months to show that given the record unemployment that we're seeing from COVID and people impacted by COVID and folks who have not been able to pay their rent, that we are looking at, you know, doubling and maybe even tripling that rate if we are not able to act quickly for a lot of what's going on right now. There also was a Zillow study that showed for every 5% increase in rent in Los Angeles, 2,000 more people fall into homelessness. So we need to, I work with homeless and low-income communities. I work on Skid Row. I, you know, have many clients who I have to get back into housing, and it's very difficult. And really this kind of begs the question of where are people supposed to live in California? This housing crisis continues to rage on. We have rising rents and stagnant wages that leave many behind, and people who are COVID impacted who now are out of work. And these consequences are felt by all of us. We've seen neighbors being forced out of communities. We've seen renters face uncertainty, and our most vulnerable are ending up on the streets. And small businesses as well are squeezed because renters spend less in their communities and workers face longer commutes. And many people are living paycheck to paycheck, and it makes it difficult for our teachers and our grocery clerks and nurses to afford housing in the communities they serve, while still having enough money for basics like groceries and gas and childcare. And skyrocketing rents now have led to, you know, over 151,000 people homeless and living on our streets. And this crisis really is only getting worse. So what this measure does is allow cities and counties to enact or expand rent control to provide assistance to their renters. And a lot of our elected officials who have been tackling homeless issues within their communities are supporting this measure for that very reason. I would say this also saves taxpayers money. So I am the drafter of SB 1380, which was carried by the great Senator Holly Mitchell. And, you know, we showed in that legislation that the cost, the estimated cost for services for people who are chronically homeless on the streets is $35,000 to $45,000 annually per person that's homeless. And this is unsustainable. This also keeps families in their homes. You know, with Prop 21, it'll help, you know, children and parents and seniors and essential workers stay in their homes. Right now, as we know, like a lot of children are pushed out of their schools. Parents are being forced into long commutes, and seniors are facing unaffordable rents, and more people are being pushed out onto the streets. And this will give the tools that our elected officials need to take action in order to make sure that they are helping their constituents. Does it mean that every single community will have rent control? No. It just means that it puts control in the hands of your city council or your county supervisors to do what's needed to help renters. This also, you know, protects single-family homeowners. So it exempts single-family homeowners. So if you're not in the rental home business, it won't affect you. If you have 2 or fewer properties or units, it won't affect you. And it keeps housing costs down, you know, and we've seen, like, particularly with COVID-19, you know, our families and teachers struggling. We've seen nurses struggling. We've seen our first responders struggling, and people just trying to find housing that's close to where they work. And so, you know, we've allowed this to get out of control. And if we keep doing the same thing, we can't expect different results. And I think I was quoted in the Daily News saying that recently when our homeless count went up again this year. So it had also it guarantees landlords a profit. And this is what Proposition 10 did. This is similar to Proposition 10, but not exactly like Proposition 10. But it guarantees landlords a profit. So, it's still fair to mom and pop landlords and renters alike. So we hope that you will support this. We have a broad coalition of elected officials and labor unions and civic organizations that are supporting this. So we have, Congress members Barbara Lee and Maxine Waters, our former Senate Pro Tem Emeritus Kevin De Leon. We have Assembly members Miguel Santiago, Wendy Carrillo, Rob Bonta, Senators Maria Elena Durazo and Ben Allen, who I believe may have Culver City. I believe he may be a state senator. And we have, over 150 members of our California Democratic Party Executive Board. We have fantastic organizations like Urban League and ACE and Coalition for Economic Survival, almost every tenant group in the state, pro-tenant group, many homeless organizations. We also have, interestingly, every single elected rent board member in the state of California supporting this. So, we just hope that, Culver City Democratic Club will join the rest of the folks. And then for labor unions, we have Unite Here supporting it, AFSCME California, the cities of West Hollywood and Santa Monica, Mayor Lindsay Horvath as a personal endorser, and Mayor Kevin McCown from Santa Monica is supporting it. We have City Council members Mike Bonin, Herb Wesson, David Rue, and Paul Corrett in Los Angeles. And so we have, a lot, and we have a lot of folks up north, but I'll spare you the long list. But it just shows that, I think one of the things that we've seen, particularly with COVID, was, various city councils who were trying to provide assistance for their renters who were out of work or otherwise impacted by COVID-19 who couldn't pay their rent. And when city councils moved for rental assistance for all renters, including those who were not not in rent stabilized units, they were threatened with lawsuits. And as a matter of fact, there is a lawsuit that was filed against the city of Los Angeles because they passed an ordinance to help renters who were not in rent stabilized units. And what they were using was basically saying that they were violating Costa-Hawkins, which is a law that prevents city councils, prevents local municipalities from enacting or expanding rent control. And because of that, it is now, like we have seen, like during this pandemic, another problem with Costa-Hawkins, which is that it's preventing our city councils from actually helping people. And it's been awful to watch as these lawsuits or threatened lawsuits are coming forward against the city of Santa Ana and the city of Los Angeles, who are just trying to help people who are suffering. And it is very frustrating too for city council members that I've spoken with who, on the one hand are getting a lot of pressure from landlord, or not from landlords, but from tenants who are saying, look, we need relief and we need help. And then on the other hand, they're getting sued, by folks who are trying to protect the state law Costa-Hawkins. So this initiative will reform Costa-Hawkins. It will again allow local municipalities to enact or expand rent control. It will help our communities immensely, including small businesses, and I hope that you will support it.
Thank you. Thank you, Susie Shannon. And our next speaker on the subject of the statewide rent control initiative, this is ballot proposition 21, am I right, Cynthia?
Yes.
Yes, ballot proposition 21 continued. Our next speaker is Alfred Twu, and I'm going to unmute Albert, and if you would,
Alfred.
Alfred,
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I
No worries.
said your name wrong.
Okay.
You can turn on your video if you like.
All right. Can you hear me and can you see the screen?
Yes, both.
All
I can
right.
see the screen and hear you.
Yeah. Thanks, Susie, for giving everyone an overview of what Prop 21 would do. I'm going to run through some of the data and details behind this proposition. Then we can take some questions. So why do we have this proposition? As Susie said, the main challenge is that rent in California has been going up a lot faster than income. Over the last couple decades, rent has gone up over 35%. Income is only up about 10%, and it's way down right now. And so we see people are being evicted, and entire neighborhoods are becoming unaffordable. As tenants move out, the rent shoots up to whatever the landlord can charge. And as Susie mentioned, the homelessness is a result. And this bar chart shows how much homelessness has increased statewide. LA County is down here. It's only gone up 7%. And so have you seen how bad it is in LA? In places like the Central Valley, where they don't have any local rent control ordinances, it's up 50%, 70%. Orange County is up 43%. Alameda County, where I'm in the Bay Area, is up 43%. And you just see the people are living in tents, they're living in vehicles, and people are overcrowded in apartments, which has become a huge risk with COVID right now. So what Prop 21 does is it allows local communities to limit rent increases and gives people peace of mind. As some of you may remember, we had a similar ballot measure 2 years ago called Prop 10. Prop 10 was a full repeal of Costa-Hawkins, and as a result, it ran into a lot of opposition from the construction industry, from mom and pop landlords. And so Prop 21 has a couple of exceptions so that people who own just a house and are trying to rent out their other house are not impacted. So a little background, rent control started in California in the 70s with cities passing local rent control ordinances. And back then they had what was called vacancy control, which meant that if I'm paying $1,000, the next tenant also pays $1,000. In 1995, the Costa-Hawkins law banned vacancy control. So now if one tenant was paying $1,000, the next tenant after them might be paying $2,000 or more. 2018, we tried to repeal Costa-Hawkins with Prop 10, didn't pass. So the following year, we had what was called the statewide rent cap, AB 1482, which I'll get into on the next slide. So here we have different examples of how rent changes over time under different systems. The orange line, you see a steady increase. That's what happens in the market if there's no protections whatsoever. The rent cap, the AB 1482, it lowered that rate of increase, but it's still inflation plus 5%. So after 10 years, the rent can still double. And also when a tenant moves out, the rent can shoot up. In places that have rent control, on buildings that are rent controlled, the rent is steady until the tenant moves out, and then it's stabilized again, but at a higher level. 21, which is down here, the blue line, the rent is steady, and when the tenant moves out, there is a limited increase of only 15% between tenants. And then true vacancy control, which is what we used to have in the 70s, is the rent stays steady permanently. So why is vacancy control? It keeps the homes permanently affordable. That's about the whole preventing the gentrification of a neighborhood. It also removes the incentive that landlords currently have to kick out somebody who's been living in a rent-controlled unit for a long time. We see that a lot up here in the Bay Area, where landlords will intentionally have noisy construction, or they'll not have working heat or water to try to get tenants who've been around for a long time to move out so that they're able to raise the rents. And it also protects the roommates from large rent increases when the last original tenant moves out. So let's go back to some of the exceptions. So the first exception is for new construction. So over here on the left, it's the orange line. In new construction, the rent is uncontrolled for the first 15 years. So if a building is built today, the city still cannot rent control it until 2035. And that's enough time for the construction company and the developer to make their money back, so that this way Prop 21 is not going to impact new housing production. And then after 15 years, the rent is controlled, and there's a 15% increase when there's a new tenant, so it stabilizes. The other main exception is for people who only own 1 or 2 houses. Let's say you currently own a house and you decide to move to a new house and rent out the old one. You would still be exempt from rent control. All right, so vacancy control is really one of the big parts of this. And this graph here shows what goes on right now, even in cities with rent control, where if the tenant is the same, the rent stays steady, and that's the green line at the bottom. But if the tenant moves, then the rent jumps right back up to market rate, and that's this jagged line in pink. And so you can see that even with rent control, once the longtime tenant moves out, that apartment is no longer affordable. Now, with Prop 21, what you would see instead is this light green line that's like a very shallow stair. And so the rent will still go up steadily over time, but it gives us a few decades to catch up on affordable housing and building homes so that we don't have this huge crisis in California. And then the roommate situation is the other one where vacancy control is important. So let's say you have an apartment where tenants A, B, and C start out living there. Tenants A and B move out. Tenant C finds a couple new roommates, and they all enjoy the protection of rent control. But then 2 years later, let's say tenant C gets a new job somewhere else and moves. Suddenly, that tenant's roommates could be looking at thousands of dollars in rent increases, because right now, Costa-Hawkins says that when that last original tenant moves out, the unit's technically vacant. If we had Prop 21, the rent would still stay low for those people. And Susie mentioned this earlier, it's got a broad base of support from a lot of elected officials. This is only a partial list. If you go to rentcontrolnow.org, you can see the full list of people and cities and organizations that have supported Prop 21. All right, thank you. And I'll drop a link to this slide show if anybody wants to review it.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Alfred. Now we can have maybe a question or two. Let's see if we have any in the chat. Let's see here. I'd like to thank our speakers for tonight. Meghan Sahli-Wells, Susie Shannon, and Alfred Twu. They've done a lot of work to prepare for this. Now, here's my first question I'm going to ask. This is more of a comment. In my opinion, the new construction is frankly where the rent control should be. Mom and pop's little 1 and 2 units, we generally don't increase rent every year, and generally not more than 3% when we do increase. So when a new tenant comes into our property, it's important for us to be able to increase rents to make, to market rents, to market rates. So that's a comment. There's no answer required there. Unless you would like to make a comment.
Sure. Actually, I do have a comment about that. So we saw this 2 years ago. It was the Prop 10 campaign where the opposition was saying that if there's rent control on new buildings, then developers won't build any new buildings. And that's really not true, because when a brand new building is built, there is no restriction on what the initial rent can be. And so if the developer wants to build a new building and charge high rents, they can do that. They just wouldn't be able to increase it if there was rent control. It's not like they're gonna charge less than they could from the get-go in the beginning. But the developer and banker world, they think differently, and they are just big oppositions to any kind of limits. And so the compromise that was reached was for the 15%, or the 15-year roll-in, and then the 15% vacancy increases. And I think another thing to think about is that sometimes there's this argument over, do we need to build more homes or do we need rent control? And sometimes people are saying there's only one way to keep housing affordable. And my take is that you need both of that. Building more homes does help, especially if it's affordable housing, but buildings take a few years to get built, whereas people need relief right now, and that right now is where the rent control kicks in.
Well, I don't think we have any actual questions in the chat at the moment.
Oh, I saw there's a question in the chat.
Here's one just popped into the chat here. How do the speakers plan?
Actually, this is Susie. I'm sorry, I was muted. I wanted to answer that comment
Susie,
just really quickly.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, first of all, like I said, this actually allows for a fair rate of return. That's part of our California Constitution for landlords. So that's one. Two, you can raise the rent but the rent is for a new tenant on vacant units 15% over 3 years, over and above what it allows for, in terms of rent control provisions. But again, I just want to point out that this is in areas or in cities or in counties where the elected officials are voting to have that come in. So what this does is give local control. It doesn't say, doesn't put a magic wand over the state and say everyone has rent control in every city and county. And so all of the policies would be tailored for the specific areas. So the type of, rent control that we see in Culver City isn't exactly what we see in Santa Monica or in West Hollywood or in the city of Los Angeles. And that really is important. And as I said, like with COVID-19, you've seen the extreme importance of that, which is, in order for people to stay in their homes, if they're impacted by COVID-19, we actually have to reform Costa-Hawkins. But there is a fair rate of return, and 15% increase in rent is allowed over 3 years for vacant units. And also for new construction, we have a carve out for 15 years to allow developers to recoup their costs. But I do agree that, you know, we do need to make sure that our newer units to after the 15 years is over are subjected to rent control if that's reasonable within the specific city or county.
Susie, there are a couple of questions here I wonder if you want to answer, Lisa, as well. The question is, what's the plan to keep owners from leaving the rental business and redeveloping it as condos?
So the other part of this too, in terms of tenant displacement, which is something that we're worried about, is to tackle the Ellis Act, which is a different law. And that's something that, you know, we are also sort of, as, you know, housing justice advocates, we are looking at as well. But yeah, that, you know, that is always the fear. And, you know, I'm like a big fan of modeling. And so I like to look at other countries, other states, other places where they have enacted rent control, where they don't have a law like Costa-Hawkins, and this just is not happening. This is sort of like a theory that is not based in any reality that we have seen anywhere else. So, you know, I don't know. I mean, it's like, you know, people can enter or exit businesses, any business really, at will, obviously, but it just hasn't like borne fruit anywhere else that we can see.
And I can speak a bit to that also. So as Susie had said, this really is about local control. And when cities are adjusting their rent control ordinances with this in mind, for example, I live in Berkeley, and to address concerns about landlords converting to condos and kicking people out, the city also passed fees on condo conversions as well as relocation payments if somebody wants to do an owner move-in. And then I see there's a question about vacant units and about a vacancy tax. So that's also something that cities can do if they want right now. And for example, Oakland recently passed a vacancy tax where if an apartment is sitting vacant, they have to pay an extra tax on it. They can do that already. Whereas right now, Costa-Hawkins limits what kinds of rent control that cities can do. So that's why Costa-Hawkins repeal has to go to the statewide ballot measure, while vacancy taxes can be something any city council can do.
Yeah, and I think it's also important a lot to take this out of the narrative of the mom and pops, because what we're actually seeing is a lot of corporate landlords who are coming in and buying up entire neighborhoods and raising rents, you know, in like entire communities, and pricing people out of their own neighborhoods. And so I know that we like to talk about things from the narrative of mom and pops, but really, like, you know, for us, you know, I think I would say that our primary opponent for this is the California Apartment Owners Association. And, you know, most of their board is made up of corporate landlords, many of whom are giving money to Republicans to, you know, run against our Democrats. So, you know, it's not, I don't feel entirely comfortable, you know, framing the whole narrative in the space of mom and pops. And I think the more that we see that this is a lot of like corporate profit and corporate ownership, I think it helps put it into a more realistic context.
Okay, so what really prompted this is that back in 2008, when the recession hit, a lot of people lost their single-family houses to foreclosure, and they were purchased by these large Wall Street landlords that own thousands of houses. And because of Costa-Hawkins, there's no way that cities can put any kind of rent control on those homes, even though they are being run by these large corporations.
We have another question. Shouldn't new construction have a vacancy control ruling as well to keep them from holding property vacant so they can wait for higher market rates? Susie, Alfred, you want to answer?
Susie, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so I can speak to the initiative itself, and it does have a carve out for 15 years, an exemption really for developers for the first 15 years, and that's really to allow them to recoup their costs. And so the initiative doesn't provide for anything other than that. There are a lot of things I think that you know, we could say it should be or whatever. But, you know, we did revamp sort of Proposition 10 a little bit. And that's one of the things where, you know, we actually listened and thought that it was reasonable to have a 15-year exemption in construction.
Yeah, and I'm going to drop a link in the chat about the vacancy tax that Oakland passed recently for discouraging vacant property.
Okay,
I see
I'm gonna,
some
I think I'm
about-
gonna have to wrap this up.
Yeah, I just want to address one last point that somebody brought up
Go ahead.
about how someone was saying didn't Costa Hawkins put in place to encourage new construction because rent control stalled property. That is not true. Rent control did not cause the slowdown of housing production in California. That was caused by changes in zoning.
Okay, I'm going to wrap up the program part of our meeting. It's past 8 o'clock, which was our stopping time, and we'll go into our business meeting for the Culver City Democratic Club. I'd like to thank our speakers again, Meghan Sahli-Wells and Alfred Twu and Susie Shannon. I thank everybody who's been typing questions and comments into the chat, and we'll make the chat available to people who would like it, and let us know, and we'll email it to you. There's a lot of stuff in there you can take a look at, some comments and questions. With that, I think the people who I would like to stay would be the people who are members of the club and can vote. If you would like to observe, I've just asked you not to vote when we have a vote if you're not a member. The program will end now, and we'll have this video on YouTube as soon as we can get it from Zoom, and then put it up on YouTube, and people can so other people who weren't able to make the meeting can see it, and those of us who were here can go back and see parts of it that they may have missed. Anyhow, I'd like to thank everybody again for coming. And now I'll
Thank
go on.
you.
All
All right.
right,
You're
thank
welcome.
you.
Okay, so the
You guys can come and turn on your cameras if you feel like it.
yeah, turn on your camera and what was this? Oh yeah, I'm going to end the recording now. Yeah, you're right. Good point.